A super advanced robot. It's probably Japanese.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that away, what are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
This is popcorn stealth. It's baby's first stealth experience. It's stealth as a style more than as a gripping mechanic. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, and Ghost of Tsushima is far, far from the only game that does this. It just so happens to be the one that I'm playing right now, but I don't think it's unfair to say that this isn't exactly the purest representation of what it's like to be a ninja assassin. This, and games like this, are a distilled, streamlined, you can even argue gimmicky version of stealth, where enemies are 50 shades of stupid, they're all turned away at exactly the right angle to leave massive blind spots for you to easily maneuver through, and failure to maintain stealth is usually met with just a shrug from both the game and the player because, you know what, the head-on combat is more fun anyways. The issue is, popcorn stealth is just about the only version of the genre still kicking. If we're talking about the last 5 to 8 years of gaming, stealth is either watered down and put into games that lean way harder into action, is not popular at all, or is Hitman. So why is that? Did developers give up on stealth? Did players lose interest? Are there fundamental aspects of stealth that just clash with most modern gaming conventions? And most importantly, is it still possible to make good, fleshed out stealth experiences? Or does stealth need to suck to survive? And before you say, yeah, I know Nakey Jakey just made a video about this, but this was written before that one, and I talk about different things, and he's a criminal, he stole it from me, and I heard his breath smells, and he hasn't cut his toenails in some weeks, so you tell me who you trust. The dedicated stealth genre has basically been a barren wasteland in recent years. Classic stealth franchises like Thief and Splinter Cell have just been excommunicated from existence, and you might be saying, what about Dishonored, or Metal Gear Solid, or even Deus Ex? But the last Dishonored game was 8 years ago. The last Deus Ex game was also 8 years ago, the last Metal Gear Solid game was 9 years ago, and the last Hollow Knight game was 7 years ago. That has nothing to do with this conversation. It just makes me sad. Since the mini-stealth renaissance in the mid-2010s, we've only had a couple of Sniper Elite games and the Hitman franchise. That's really it, at least in the AAA space. Everything else you could very easily argue has stealth as a secondary focus. Secondary in the marketing, secondary in the attention given to the skill trees and abilities, secondary in the amount of time in-game with this gameplay loop, secondary in polish, and secondary in quality control. Now if we're talking outside of AAA, a huge force in the modern stealth era was Me games. Me were the people behind Shadow Tactics, Desperados, and their newest game, Shadow Gambit. It was just a team that refined their craft with each entry, and they really kept the genre alive in a time where, and they were shut down 10 days after their most recent game came out. Now, in fairness, the cited reason for this isn't that the games were selling poorly, it was more of a, these games are very stressful to make and we're tired of the whole process kind of situation, but if the games had been selling well, this probably doesn't happen. The truth is, stealth today is a supplemental part of games. It's a way to diversify a gameplay loop and add a bit of depth to the moment-to-moment activities, but not many studios are both willing and able to let it stand on its own. I think So Says Jay said it best in his video about stealth games.
Stealth is no longer a genre, it is a feature.
And not only is it just a feature, it's usually a very stripped down one. Whether we're talking about Assassin's Creed, The Last of Us, Far Cry, or Tomb Raider, we're constantly being served the old-fashioned plain donut version of stealth. Patrol routes either don't exist or only a couple of enemies in a scenario have them. You can practically run full sprint behind an enemy and assassinate them before they're fully alerted to your position. Everyone is vigilantly observing the walls instead of maybe, I don't know, the giant open spaces where somebody might be walking through. And even if an enemy does see a dead body, they react by running over slowly, gyrating their head around a little bit, alerting some of the others, being on high alert for a while, which really means they're not more careful, they don't react faster, and they don't check hiding spots more frequently, they just kind of walk around a little bit, and then they just go back to their post again 30 seconds later, completely forgetting that anything even happened. Or better yet, yell out, "There's something over there," and then just walk the other way. Even the animations have gotten lazier. Half the time in the new Assassin's Creed games, you're just awkwardly stabbing people in the ass until they collapse like a bag of sand. That's the modern stealth experience. It's immensely forgiving, and it does everything in its power to make sure that you don't slow down, even though sneaking around is an inherently slow activity. Stealth in these games is not much more than a fun, quick side activity that can be used to thin the herd, and it's often engaged with recklessly because, one, you can get away with that most of the time, and two, if you don't get away with it, it, you could just start slamming your sword into people's skulls, even better. It's really doing everything in its power to not be taken seriously. The only major stealth game in recent years where breaking stealth feels like you're doing something wrong is Hitman, and even then, you still have the option to go a little louder if you want. In this case, Hitman naturally rewards stealth approaches by making non-stealth ones seem kinda messy, firefights seem clunky, and just giving you so many options for stealth that full action just seems dumb. And we'll talk a little bit more in a second about how certain design principles can unsuck modern stealth. But first, I want to talk about why the industry might be shying away from this, and how a huge part of it might be psychological. A lot of what makes a game enjoyable to play comes down to rewards. If you do a thing successfully, you will get a reward of some kind, whether it's tangible, like new gear or more currency, or something intangible, like progressing to the next story beat, or finally beating an enemy that's been a major roadblock. Games are built off of positive and negative reinforcement, getting something good or having something annoying taken away as a result of good actions, and that encourages the player to do more good things. This is really easy to set up in something like an action game because on top of the regular reward systems, every enemy you defeat is getting you closer to success until you clear out a full area and hit 100% success. You could also imagine things like taking damage as a minor setback throughout this whole process, which makes trying to get to your success point really engaging. But stealth works differently. This is how I like to look at it. When you're in an action game, in a combat scenario, the easiest way that you can define your goal is beat everybody up. Given that's the definition of success here, you start at 0% success because you haven't done anything yet, and you end at 100% success if things go well. There's very clear and positively trending progression in every encounter. But in a stealth game, the clearest way you can define your goal is don't be seen. Of course, you have like other actual concrete goals in both experiences, but in terms of the antagonistic forces of the game and your relation to them, your goal is do not be seen by these people, whether by killing them stealthily or just avoiding their gaze altogether. Given that definition, you technically start with 100% success, and then if you make any mistake, barring the maybe 1 second of leeway you get when being detected by enemies, you will move down to 0% success instantly. This is like getting a gold star for every good thing you do, and this is like if a teacher gave everyone a gold star as they walked into class, and then if you miscategorize a simile as a metaphor, they rip the star clean off your forehead and call you a dumbass. And yes, obviously you could argue that killing people in a stealth game is also a form of progress, just like it is in an action game, which is technically true, but I'd say you're still only handling half of the equation here. The challenge is still not to be seen. People view being caught in a stealth game as just an automatic failure in a way that you just don't think of when you take damage in an action game. And part of that is that in some games, it is an automatic fail state, or considering how hopeless you are outside of combat, it might as well be. And in the games that don't do that, there's probably a challenge for each level that pushes you not to be seen. Even though there are plenty of stealth-oriented games where you can get away with constantly being detected, it undeniably feels wrong doing that, which can make completing sections less satisfying because there's always a caveat that the game is all too eager to remind you of. Stealth games also delay gratification, and there have been multiple studies on how immediate rewards and positive reinforcement gives people more motivation, whereas punishment for bad performance or delayed rewards, which only come after a sequence of good actions, can build up stress and frustration. Chances are, you probably don't want to be stressed out playing video games, and if you do, you probably want to be able to do something actionable about it, like, you know, fighting. But if your stress and brain power hinges on things like planning your moves and looking at all the different routes and enemy locations, it's much easier to lose patience, rush into things, and usually get caught doing so. That's why all these popcorn stealth games are so linear and simplified when it comes to enemy position. It's very carefully constructed to make it as easy as humanly possible to stealth around everywhere, while still at least slightly making you feel like you're sneaking up and killing people like a ninja. It's basically a stealth set piece. If they did anything more inspired than this, especially in a game where action is heavily marketed, a large chunk of the casual player base would get incredibly frustrated in these sections. But the thing is, stealth is still really fun when it's done correctly. People love Splinter Cell, they love the old Thief games, they love MGS5. The Dishonored games are modern classics. It's not like this stuff is never fun or engaging despite all the things I just mentioned. So what changed in the last 10 years? Maybe it was the rise of multitasking while gaming, an increasing number of people listen to podcasts or watch TV while playing games, and that could hurt the stealth genre a little bit more than less thoughtful experiences. Because it's a lot easier to dump your brain out and play Devil May Cry while listening to a podcast than it is to plan a 17-move sequence in Desperados. Also, attention spans are shorter, demanding faster reward loops and marketing that builds on the expectation of fast-paced combat. But more than just these uncontrollable factors in player behavior, I think the evolution evolution of gaming in general has basically Darwined these things out of existence. Because what's expected of a modern game and how they've basically conditioned us to think has made it almost impossible to make a stealth game that has a wide appeal. Wait, just kidding. Section 2.5 here, really quick announcement. I just started a new channel. What better way to hardly keep up with one channel than to make another one? It's called Video Essay Speedruns. It's basically just a place for me to do shorter content and talk about literally anything, not just bigger topics. I have a video on there right now about video game crossovers. Check it out after this one. I'll link to it in the description and remind you at the end. So you better subscribe. Okay, back to the video. Over the years, one of the biggest things that players have demanded and games have catered to is the idea of control, whether it's real control or the illusion of it. Players want more control over who they are, what they wear, what abilities they have, which skills they want to prioritize, which order to tackle things, which faction they want to swear their allegiance to, who they want to bone, what they want to say. Not every game will let you do all of this, but the most popular ones try to at least fool you into thinking that you have a ton of control. This creates a bit of a problem for stealth games in a few different ways. The most obvious one is if you want stealth to be worth something, you can't just reward the player for breaking it and engaging head-on, which instantly makes the player feel like they have less options and less power. This is why I feel like a lot of games have basically just caved on this and made action in stealth games a lot more fun than the stealth itself. The next issue is that stealth is reliant on the line of sight of multiple agents at the same time, and your own limited line of sight creates a problem where you might try and engage with an enemy only for some dickhead on a tower you didn't even know was there to see you and raise the alarm. You can't actually see where all the sources of danger are, which makes you feel like you have limited control, which leads to a lot of trial and error tactics and save scumming, aka constantly saving throughout an encounter, even every few seconds. An early response to this, especially for games where stealth was less of an actual focus and more of a feature, was listening mode, where you could just hear through the walls to see exactly where enemies were and which ways they were headed. A feature that flipped the problem all the way in the other direction and potentially gave players too much control. It basically just turned on a god mode and all but played the section for you, and you didn't even need to do anything to earn it. The middle ground nowadays seems to be scouting and tagging. You can scope out an area first, tag enemies, and then you're able to keep tabs on them while you're in the base. It's not a perfect solution, but it at least gives you some control and a reward for at least a basic level of planning. But because these solutions make it really easy to know where everything is at all times, it basically conditioned players over the years to always expect some form of tracking enemies behind walls and buildings, which can trivialize some of the challenge. But if you don't have this, the players feel like something is missing. It's a bit of a lose-lose. Then there's kind of the finicky nature of scaling enemies and player progression. In an action game, your enemies get more powerful as you go on. They get more health, or there's more of them, or there's like a mini-boss tossed in there, whatever, but you get more powerful as a counter to that. Getting more powerful over time means you're constantly being given rewards, but the game isn't trivialized in the process because enemy encounters are also getting harder. This whole system is also harder in stealth because how exactly do you make enemies harder? If you do it by just like giving them larger view cones, that can mess with the player's natural understanding of how far enemies should be able to see in video games, so that's usually no good. If you increase difficulty by making enemies impervious to some of your abilities, that minimizes control once again and is usually a point of frustration. There's a reason imperviousness is hardly ever a thing in modern video games. And if you want to make it more difficult by setting up intricately placed enemies in the later stages of the game where everyone has 2 to 3 people watching their back and is constantly pacing around trying to find you, even with more powerful characters by the end of it, it can increase the trial and error and minimize the control by making it seem like there's only one correct way to tackle this obstacle course. The best stealth games still take a stab at trying to create a solid progression system, but I've always found that the final stages of most stealth games can be a lot more frustrating than it is fun. No matter which way you slice it, stealth games are fighting an uphill battle against what is expected of a modern video game. It's fighting against the expectation that the last 15 years of gaming have been slowly introducing, and most of all, the expectation that every single game should always plan around the failure of stealth, not its success. Let's take a game like The Last of Us, where stealth is a way to save ammo and minimize your time being chased or shot at, but if shit hits the fan, now you're really in the thick of the action gameplay. Every single encounter is built off the idea that if a player fails stealth, they not only have an alternative, but a very fun alternative. In the Arkham games, some sections feature spread out gunmen who shoot at you if you break stealth, so you can't just jump into the action like you normally would. But the game does equip you with smoke bombs, vents, and perches to swing off of until the enemy eventually loses sight of you. You still technically have to stealth in these these sections, but if you fail that, it's incredibly easy to brush it off and reset, minimizing the impact of being seen. Even a predominantly stealth game will usually succeed by giving you viable action gameplay if you fail to stealth. In fact, when a game like Origami came along and it didn't have enjoyable or viable combat options, a good chunk of people complained about that, leading to them fleshing out the combat a little bit more in the sequel. These games are all designed around making stealth feel less vital, so you don't feel as bad when you break it. But that doesn't mean that you can't create killer stealth experiences, and I actually think that there are some upcoming stealth games that have the potential to breathe new life into a bit of a dying genre. Mark of the Ninja and Desperados are two of my favorite pure stealth experiences, and both of them put focus on stealth by making any other approach entirely unreliable. Your character's armor is basically made of wet tissue paper, so if you mess up stealth, you pay for it. Engaging head-on or being spotted is very thoroughly discouraged. And while they're pretty different games, I do think they both benefit from being 2D, because they have so much more control over what you see and how it frames enemies, which can remove the problem of never knowing what's in your periphery. Even though both of these games, especially Mark of the Ninja, aren't exactly new, I think the indie space is where the stealth genre can thrive in its most purest form, although whether people actually want that or not is another question, because none of these incredibly made indie stealth games have sold all that well. As far as AAA or 3D games go, I do think there's some merit to the power fantasy stealth games, you know, the snappier, faster, more fluid stealth systems where you always have a number of ranged options to speed things up. You can jump assassinate, chain assassinate, whistle, or throw rocks to get enemies out of place. All these things that let you cruise through a battlefield effortlessly. It's all done to tackle some of the inherent problems with the concept of stealth and almost make you feel like you're playing as a legend, as almost a retelling of something that actually happened, where people describe this unseen ghost assassin who ripped through armies without ever being seen. And yeah, there's a level of catharsis you can reach with that, but also, if enemies are always donut-brained and half the time you can't even be bothered to create a more complex scenario than two people standing next to each other, it just makes the experience feel cheap. I hope some of these games provide more options for stealth approaches, because the more options you have as a player, the more complex the scenario can be while maintaining a level of balance. Because yeah, it's true that the powers in Dishonored make combat fun, which can lessen the impact of being spotted, but they also make the stealth fun enough to give a real shot in the first place. Teleport, bend time, create a doppelganger, make enemies disappear on death. These let you tackle an encounter in a dozen different ways and open up more routes for you to be able to sneak through places. And things like being able to quickly teleport to somewhere and then teleport out just as quickly can speed up stealth in a more natural way than just painfully stupid, unaware, and unfocused enemy AI. The original Ghost of Tsushima kind of played around with some supernatural elements, and I really hope that they lean further into that for the sequel, because being able to have these kinds of abilities for that game in the future would be like really sick. I would love that. Of course, this is always paired best with intricate and layered level design that can be tackled in different ways, and unfortunately you just can't always do that for a game like Ghost, which is not only an open world where most combat encounters take place in simple camps, but level design for a game that prioritizes combat and a game that prioritizes stealth are generally pretty different. So if you want to give the player the option to do either at any time, you're probably going to end up with something pretty stripped down. But while it might not hit the stealth heights of a game like Dishonored, it can still become more dynamic than we got in the first iteration. I'm also just a little bit hopeful that Assassin's Creed Shadows can be a step in the right direction for stealth. They've created two distinct characters, and one of them really commits to a sneaky playstyle with worse armor, mediocre full-blown combat options, and then just a ton of ways to take down enemies from the shadows, including creating more shadows. It's still like unnaturally fast, it'll likely make enemies not all that reactive, and they won't have the most engaging levels to tackle, but I'm at least curious to see the numbers on how many people played the stealth character over the samurai, and whether those stats can influence any future AAA stealth games. As far as pure stealth games go, I feel like the industry has like no interest in these anymore. Even Hitman, which kind of cracked the code with all of this, is a very specific type of puzzle game that can't really be replicated without sort of ripping it off. It's a little sad to say that I think stealth will continue to be relegated to being a mechanic, not a genre, but I just think that's how it has to be right now. And until somebody can think up, successfully pitch, and produce a successful game that feels like a true, fresh take on stealth, we're gonna continue to see it as a secondary option whenever it shows up. So for now, to answer my biggest question from the intro, I do think stealth needs to suck for a little bit to survive. But also, if Arcane makes Dishonored 3, I take back everything. Please, for the love, please make Dishonored 3. I'm begging you. Whoa there, end of the video reminder, go check out that Video Game Speedruns channel. It's in the description. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll see you next time. Bye.